February 11th, 2006, 6:10 a.m. A Boeing 737 lifts off from Jakarta with 146 people on board. Destination, Makassar, a simple 2-hour flight across Indonesia. But 20 minutes into the flight, something begins to happen. Something invisible. Something that will turn this routine flight into every pilot's worst nightmare. The aircraft starts drifting, slowly, silently, 500 kilometers off course. The terrifying part? Every instrument in the cockpit says they're flying straight to their destination. The screens lie. The computers lie. Even the autopilot lies. But the ocean below doesn't lie, and neither do the mountains that suddenly appear where no mountains should exist. How do you navigate when you can't trust anything? What happens when technology becomes your enemy? This is Inside Aero Disasters, and the story of the flight that didn't crash, but simply vanished while still flying. Adam Air Flight 782 was assigned aircraft PKKKE, a Boeing 737-329 that had been flying for 19 years. That morning, ground engineers discovered the number 2 inertial reference unit had failed. The IRU is critical. It tells the aircraft where it is by tracking every movement from takeoff. When it fails, navigation becomes unreliable. The solution should have been simple. Replace the faulty unit and test it thoroughly. Instead, Adam Air's maintenance crew swapped it with another IRU from their parts inventory. They ran a quick ground test, saw it was working, and cleared the aircraft for departure. What they didn't know was that this working replacement had its own intermittent faults. This wasn't unusual for Adam Air. The airline had grown rapidly since 2003, backed by political connections and painted in bright marketing colors. But behind the facade was a fleet of aging aircraft maintained under a system where safety was negotiable. Engineers had logged repeated IRU failures on this same aircraft. The problems were noted, temporarily fixed, then ignored. The flight crew consisted of a 41-year-old captain with over 7,000 flight hours and a 33-year-old first officer with nearly 3,000 hours. Both were experienced on the 737. They had no reason to suspect the navigation system they trusted was about to betray them. At 6:10 a.m., Flight 782 departed Jakarta with 146 passengers and crew, bound for Makassar, a routine 2-hour flight northeast across Indonesia. The engines spooled up, the aircraft climbed smoothly, and for the first 15 minutes, everything appeared normal. Then the flight management computer made a decision. It had been using the captain's IRU, the one that was working correctly. But as the aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude, the system quietly switched to the first officer's IRU, the one that had been replaced that morning, the one with hidden faults. There was no warning, no alarm, no indication on any display. The autopilot simply began following new navigation data that was slowly, invisibly corrupted. The aircraft banked gently to the right. Instead of flying northeast toward Makassar, Flight 782 was now turning south. The pilots, focused on their climb checklist and routine communications, noticed nothing. Their instruments showed a perfect flight path. The autopilot was engaged in following commands. But those commands were wrong, and with every passing minute, the error was growing larger. The plane was no longer flying toward Makassar, and no one in the cockpit knew it. Flight 782 was now flying south instead of northeast, but the cockpit showed no indication of the change. The navigation display presented a straight line to Makassar. The autopilot followed its program route. Every instrument agreed they were on course. The captain was conducting a routine training check with one of the flight attendants. This was standard procedure. Cabin crew needed periodic evaluations, and the cockpit was calm enough for the exercise. As he questioned her about emergency procedures, neither pilot was monitoring their actual ground track. The flight attendant being tested noticed something odd. Looking out the cockpit window, she saw the sun was positioned to the left of the aircraft. On a morning flight from Jakarta to Makassar, the sun should have been directly ahead or slightly to the right. She said nothing. Surely the experienced pilots knew what they were doing. 25 minutes into the flight, a caution message appeared on the first officer's screen. IRSNAVONLY. This indicated the aircraft was relying solely on its inertial reference system without backup signals from ground-based navigation beacons. Over the Java Sea, this wasn't unusual. The first officer acknowledged the warning and cleared it without concern. But the aircraft was drifting further off course with each passing minute. The faulty IRU was feeding incorrect position data to the flight management computer, which dutifully commanded the autopilot to maintain what it believed was the correct heading. The error was compounding, 7 nautical miles of deviation for every minute of flight time. On the ground, air traffic control was failing to catch the error. The route adherence monitoring system was set to trigger an alert if an aircraft strayed more than 20 nautical miles from its assigned route. Flight 782 hadn't reached that threshold yet. The controller saw the flight's transponder signal and assumed it was following the filed flight plan. By now, the aircraft had crossed into uncontrolled airspace. It was flying through busy air corridors without clearance, heading toward mountainous terrain it was never meant to overfly. The pilots requested and received clearance for a shortcut to Makassar, entering new waypoints into their navigation system. The aircraft turned again, this time following the corrupted data even deeper into the wrong direction. The first officer began preparing for their descent into Makassar. He calculated fuel requirements and reviewed approach procedures. Everything appeared routine. The captain finished his training session and returned his attention to flying. Neither pilot realized they were now over 300 kilometers off course, flying toward an island that wasn't on their charts, burning fuel on a route that would never reach their destination. The aircraft was lost, and it was about to get much worse. The first officer requested clearance to begin their descent to Makassar. Air traffic control approved the request, and Flight 782 started down from 33,000 feet. The pilots expected to see the familiar coastline of Sulawesi ahead. Instead, they saw something that shouldn't exist: mountains, rising directly in front of them. The captain immediately recognized the problem. The flight plan showed a flat coastal approach to Makassar. The terrain below was mountainous islands that didn't match any chart. He grabbed the flight manual and began checking their position against the navigation displays. The VOR receiver, tuned to the Makassar beacon, showed an inoperative flag. The signal was either offline or they were too far away to receive it. The captain tried other navigation aids. Nothing worked. The first officer checked the magnetic compass, one of the few instruments not connected to the aircraft's navigation computers. It showed they were flying southwest, not northeast, toward their destination. The compass couldn't lie, but their sophisticated navigation system said they were on course. The captain attempted to reset the inertial reference system. He switched from the malfunctioning unit to the backup IRU. The system began a realignment process that would take several minutes. During this time, they would have no electronic navigation assistance. The aircraft was now flying manually at 28,000 feet over unfamiliar terrain. The first officer's primary flight display flickered, then went dark. His altitude, airspeed, and heading indicators were gone. Only the basic standby instruments remained functional. The captain tried to contact air traffic control. No response. He attempted to reach other aircraft on the emergency frequency. Silence. They were beyond radio range of any ground station or aircraft. At their current consumption rate, they had perhaps 90 minutes of flight time remaining. But 90 minutes to where? They didn't know their position, their heading was unreliable, and their primary navigation systems had failed. The first officer opened the emergency procedures manual to the section on navigation system failures. The instructions were clear. Use the magnetic compass to determine heading, identify known landmarks, and establish position through dead reckoning. But the islands below matched nothing in their charts. The captain reduced power and leveled off at 15,000 feet. Lower altitude would improve their chances of establishing radio contact and identifying landmarks. It would also give them more time to find a place to land if their fuel situation became critical. They began flying a search pattern, hoping to spot a recognizable coastline or airport. The fuel burn was increasing with each course change. Time was running out. They weren't just lost. They were lost with no way to determine where they were, no way to communicate their situation, and no guarantee they could find an airport before their fuel ran out. The aircraft that had departed Jakarta as a routine scheduled flight was now flying a desperate search for survival. After 30 minutes of searching, the captain spotted a runway. It was on a small island with no obvious identifying features, but it was their only option. The fuel quantity was becoming critical. The airport was Tambalaka on the island of Sumba, 481 kilometers southeast of their intended destination. The runway was designed for smaller regional aircraft like the Fokker F-28, not a fully loaded Boeing 737. The captain had no way of knowing this. He attempted to contact the airport tower. No response. There was no control tower, no weather information, no runway specifications. They would have to land using visual references alone. The approach was complicated by the aircraft's weight. Flight 782 was carrying fuel for a 2-hour flight plus reserves. The extra weight meant higher approach speeds and longer landing distances. The captain had no data on runway length, surface conditions, or obstacles. He configured the aircraft for landing, flaps extended, landing gear down, engines at approach power. The first officer called out airspeeds and altitudes using the few instruments that remained functional. There was no instrument landing system, no approach lighting, no ground guidance. The runway appeared shorter than normal commercial airports. Tambalaka's single runway was only 1,500 meters long. A Boeing 737 typically requires 1,800 meters for a normal landing. With their current weight and configuration, they needed even more distance. The captain crossed the runway threshold at 140 knots. The moment the main landing gear touched down, he applied maximum braking and selected reverse thrust on both engines. The aircraft decelerated rapidly, but the end of the runway was approaching fast. Trees and rough terrain lay beyond the runway's end. The captain maintained maximum braking pressure, feeling the aircraft slow but uncertain if it would stop in time. The anti-skid system prevented the wheels from locking, but the stopping distance was marginal. The Boeing 737 rolled to a stop with less than 200 meters of runway remaining. The engines spooled down to idle. The cabin was silent except for the sound of cooling metal and hydraulic systems. 146 people had survived an approach and landing that should have been impossible. The captain shut down the engines and began the post-flight checklist, still unsure of where they had landed. Only when he contacted Adam Air's operations center did he learn the truth. They were on Sumba, hundreds of kilometers from their intended destination. The aircraft was intact, the passengers were safe, but their navigation failure had exposed something far more dangerous than a single flight going off course. The system that was supposed to prevent this type of incident had failed completely, and this was just the beginning. Adam Air's response was immediate and predictable. They fired the flight crew, claiming pilot error had caused the incident. The aircraft was flown back to Jakarta without passengers and placed under investigation by Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee. The airline's public statement blamed a navigation system malfunction, but insisted their maintenance procedures were adequate. They had the pilots arrested on charges of endangering passenger safety. Behind the scenes, Adam Air was working to contain the damage to their reputation. The investigation revealed the truth. The IRU that failed during flight had a documented history of malfunctions. Maintenance logs showed repeated faults over several months. Engineers had reported the problems, but instead of replacing the unit, Adam Air's maintenance crew had repeatedly reset it, swapped it between aircraft, and returned it to service. This wasn't an isolated incident. The investigation found that Adam Air routinely used political connections to bypass safety regulations. The airline's founder, Agung Laksono, was Speaker of Indonesia's House of Representatives. When aviation authorities attempted to ground aircraft or impose safety requirements, political pressure ensured the airline continued operating. Pilots reported being forced to fly aircraft they knew were unsafe. Maintenance records were falsified. Parts were swapped between aircraft to avoid mandatory replacement deadlines. The corporate culture prioritized schedule adherence and cost reduction over safety. The Directorate General of Air Communications ordered Adam Air to conduct 13 test flights with government inspectors before returning the aircraft to service. Instead, Adam Air sent only their own engineers to Sumba, left behind the government inspection team, and returned the aircraft to commercial service without proper oversight. Flight 782 had exposed a systemic failure in Indonesian aviation oversight, but the warning went unheeded. 11 months later, on January 1, 2007, Adam Air Flight 574 departed Surabaya for Manado. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-400 with the same type of inertial reference system that had failed on Flight 782. The maintenance log showed over 40 pilot complaints about various systems, including repeated IRU malfunctions. Flight 574 crashed into the Makassar Strait, killing all 102 people on board. The investigation concluded that the pilots became preoccupied with troubleshooting the failed navigation system and lost control of the aircraft. The same type of system failure that had been survivable on Flight 782 became fatal when the crew couldn't manage the workload. The crash triggered a government investigation into Atom Air's operations. Investors began withdrawing support. By 2008, the airline had lost most of its fleet to repossession. The final blow came when the airline's co-founder, Sandra Ang, was arrested for embezzling over $200 million from company funds. Atom Air's operating license was revoked in March 2008. The airline ceased operations, its remaining aircraft were scrapped, and its executives faced criminal charges. The bright colors and political connections that had once protected the airline couldn't survive the scrutiny that followed Flight 782's miraculous survival. The flight that didn't crash had ultimately exposed the rot that would kill 102 people and destroy an entire airline. Flight 782 presents a terrifying paradox. The 146 people who survived revealed something more dangerous than most crashes. What happens when every safety system fails quietly? The navigation computers lied. The maintenance records were falsified. The oversight was compromised. Yet the aircraft still landed safely. But that survival exposed the rot that would kill 102 people on Flight 574 11 months later. This is aviation's most dangerous incident type, the warning that gets covered up. Sometimes the flights that don't crash tell the most important stories. If you want to understand how disasters really happen through quiet compromises that become catastrophic, subscribe to Inside Aero Disasters, because the warnings are often more dangerous than the crashes.